Okay, part 3, chapter 1. We pick it up. We've talked about quantitative and qualitative research. Your book discusses the quantitative research model, the deductive and inductive method. One of the things I want in your notes is also what we'll discuss later when we talk about critical thinking, that in each of these models are a set of assumptions. And often the sort of bedeviling part of any research is, what assumptions am I taking into my research? Some assumptions about causality, some assumptions about how society or people work. Sometimes the assumptions are buried even deeper in that, what are my assumptions coming from the fact, let's say, that I'm an American and that I'm white and I'm male and middle class and all of those other things that find our way into research models. So there's a discussion of variables next. Independent and dependent variables. This is important to understand. The independent variable causes a change in the dependent variable. So the one that I always remember is independent. Let's go with race. Who makes more money in the United States? White citizens or black citizens? White citizens. So race would be your independent variable. Income would be your dependent variable. If you go backwards through it and it doesn't make any sense, then you probably have the arrows pointing in the right direction. So if I earn more money and I'm black, will I become white? Of course not. That's silly. That's not how that works. Same thing for gender. Who makes more money in America, men or women? Men. Gender there being your independent variable, income being your dependent variable. Going backwards, so if I'm a woman and I make more money, will I become a man? Of course not, that doesn't make any sense. So there's a lot of discussion of causality. Sometimes you get something that has multiple vectors of causality. They're talking about suicide in your book. Poverty, religious participation, all of these things can affect suicide rate. So then there's another discussion of validity and reliability. Okay. Validity means I'm really studying what I think I'm studying. Reliability means that I can do it over and over. And in the hard sciences, those are pretty much often the same things. I put potassium in water, I get the same reaction all the time. But people aren't like that. People change often based on the fact that they're just being studied. Makes it very bedeviling. So I sometimes have something that I can get over and over. It's actually not valid, even if it is reliable. So let's talk about IQ scores. IQ scores. Oh, everyone, if you've gotten a good IQ score, everyone's very excited about their good IQ score. And I'm sorry about that, but that test was never designed to do what we think it was designed to do. It was actually a test developed by a Frenchman to work with those that had mental retardation. He noticed that some could have jobs and participate, and some were more profound, and he came up with a test for it. Somebody in the eugenics movement takes that test, brings it back here to the United States, and sure enough, starts giving it out to people. And what do we find out? Why is it reliable and not valid? Well, white middle-class males that ended up coming up with the questions did really, really good on that test. And other groups of people didn't. It wasn't a test of IQ at all. It was basically a test of cultural and class contact. But the school systems gave out that test. The Army gave out that test. We have literally 100 years of that test. There was a book called The Bell Curve several years back. People went buck wild about this book because, again, very much like Herbert Spencer, it said that white rich people were the smartest, bestest people in the whole wide world, and you could prove it with 100 years of IQ data. And again, it was very reliable. You can absolutely show those scores over and over, and that, you know, blacks and Hispanics and poor people and women were not as IQ. Well, it turns out that has nothing to do with intelligence. It had to do with who made the test up and those sort of class and cultural contacts. Even if it was reliable, I could do it over and over, which is what the bell curve saw, it's not valid. Not really actually getting at IQ. First of all, just the idea that one test can get at all the different kinds of intelligence, like linguistic, music, spatial, kinetic intelligence, is just silly. It's a silly thing. Great book called The Mismeasure of Man, if you ever want to read that. Outstanding book about that topic. Then we talk about different kinds of research methods, survey research. That's what sociology does. We do the census. We do a lot of surveys. If it's a bad survey, chances are it's probably a marketing survey. We do secondary analysis. We get numbers from different sources, and we go through that and pour through that for patterns and content. We do field research, something called participant observation, where you embed yourself with a group to really learn how they do a thing, or you embed yourself, let's say, in a detailed area. You want to study the life of, let's say, poor people in Harlem, or let's say that would be an ethnography, or let's say I wanted to understand how bikers do what bikers do, and that's participant observation, where I would, gain the trust and perhaps even pose as a biker to then get that information. The thing that we don't get to do very often is what's called experimental group research. This is where you have the experiment group that receives a stimulus, control group doesn't receive the stimulus. Because honestly, what we have to do is get children and raise them wrong and then see how they fared versus the children that were raised under cultural. And people get jumpy about their kids, so they don't really let us do that very often. Then we get to the ethical research questions in sociology. Your book talks about Zellner. He studied what was called autocides, where he found out that a lot of single car fatal collisions weren't actually accidents. They were on purposes. They were suicides. And the ethical issue of that, say, well, what's the ethical issue of that? Big deal. Well, the families, the people that participated, when his research, they didn't understand where he was going with that research. He wasn't exactly as clear as he should have been. And, if the insurance company did a payout, they wanted their money back. So that actually ended up hurting families too. So part of research is you can't hurt anybody either through direct action or indirect action as a researcher. You have to protect the people that you study. There are going to be three others that I'm going to mention here that are in your book, so hopefully you're making notes. One was a researcher named Humphreys. He did a study called the tea room trade. This was back in the late 60s, early 70s. Tea room was a code word for the public bathrooms out on the highways. And homosexual men would meet out there, and that was their code word. And there would be a way that they would go about it. Usually there'd be a lookout person, and then two people would, make a love connection there in the public bathroom out on the highway. And what Humphreys did was he went out there and he posed as a lookout, and he was secretly writing down license plate numbers and good and bad things. Good things was that up until this point, homosexuality was considered this tremendous mental defect problem, and homosexuals were considered, like crazy hobo people, and find out, oh no, actually, guess what? People that were participating in the tea room trade were, doctors, lawyers, police officers, city council members. That was very shocking at the time. Bad thing. The police came and wanted his data to track these people down as being part of participating in a crime. So he could have, luckily he wrote it down in code, not a very good code, but that was very scary for his participants because it's not like today. 1970, you'd be run out of town, lose your job, your spouse could divorce you, you never see your kids again. It was a horrific reaction society had to homosexuality. Milgram, our second other one that's on the book. Stanley Milgram did what's called the Milgram shock experiment. We'll talk about it again later in more detail, but basically he had people come in and say, hey, we're going to do this study on learning, and you're going to ask this person in the next room questions, and you saw them all hooked up to electrodes. And if they get a question wrong, you punch the red button in front of you, and they get a shock. And clearly on the dial was, like dangerous, lethal shock. And just because somebody in a lab coat and clipboard told them to do this, regular Americans were willing to give what they thought were dangerous, potentially lethal shocks to a complete stranger. Now, the good news was the people in the next room weren't actually hooked up to electrodes. They pressed a little button, light went on, and they became theater students and acted like they were being hurt. But the people that participated really thought that they were hurting somebody else. And that wasn't what they said they were studying. So I was lied to as the participant, and I found out that I'm really kind of a terrible person. The third one, Zimbardo, he did what's called the prison experiment. They actually made a movie of this. He got the graduate students together, built a prison in the bottom of the Stanford psych building, and imprisoned people. He went just randomly, you're a prisoner, you're a guard, you're a prisoner, you're a guard. And it was supposed to last for a while. I had to stop the experiment. A person was taken out on a gurney, had a breakdown, found out that people reacted to that role in authority so dramatically that guards became abusive and prisoners became recalcitrant and difficult and informants. And it was a very, very disturbing thing. He got in trouble, but because we wanted to use his research, he didn't get in that much trouble and is actually head of the graduate psychology department at Stanford now. Anyway, so that's the end of chapter 1, part 3.